That book was a little unusual because it was written over time and it was written in sections. Originally, about 5 years ago, we came out with a concordance of my world called The World of Ice and Fire, put together from historical references and stories that are actually in the novels. And I was supposed to write some sidebars for it, little bits about history that I knew that I'd never actually put in the novels. The whole book was supposed to have 50,000 words of prose and the rest all art. And after I wrote 350,000 words of sidebars, I said, this isn't going to work. So we pulled out all the sidebars and made a different book of them. But I still had some holes, so I still had to write some more, fill in a few gaps where I'd skipped over kings and so forth. So it was written in bits and chunks over years.
It gives the backstory to many of the major plot points in A Song of Ice and Fire, making it a must-read, I suppose, for Game of Thrones fanatics who will want to know. I mean, there are certain questions that they will want to ask, because it being a prequel, as it were.
Yes. And not actually a traditional novel. It's more a work of imaginary history. It reads like a history textbook, hopefully an interesting history textbook.
Yeah.
Full of all the juicy stuff about murders and poisonings and affairs and all of that great stuff.
All of that stuff is great.
It sounds like you had a lot of fun writing this. Was it something you'd always wanted to do?
I did. Yes, actually. Decades ago, when I first started writing, I was writing primarily science fiction at that point. There was a number of science fiction writers have future histories, as they call them. Robert A. Heinlein was the first one to coin that term. And I thought, all these people have future histories, but nobody ever writes the future history textbook. It's just a reference here, a reference there. So I thought that would be fun to do one of these days. Initially, back in the 70s and 80s, I was thinking of doing it for my own science fiction future history, The Thousand Worlds. But instead, I wound up doing it a past history for the Targaryens. And that's only one of two, that book, by the way. I only got up to Aegon III.
Okay.
So I still have to do from Aegon III to the present.
There's stories that there's going to be a prequel to Game of Thrones. Is that based on the new book Fire and Blood, or is that even before that?
Yeah, HBO put into the works a couple of years ago, knowing Game of Thrones would be ending, actually 5 successor shows, I call them. All of these successor shows were prequels set in various points in the past, and one of them, done by Jane Goldman, the wonderful British writer.
Yes, we know Jane very well, of course, yeah.
Yeah, she's scripted and been the showrunner for the first of them to be filmed, and Jane is now here in London doing her post-production and putting together the first cut for HBO to see and myself to see. Then HBO will make a decision whether to order a full series or not.
And in terms of the TV series Game of Thrones, because am I right in thinking that the TV series ended before you'd written the books?
Yes, I'm still writing the last 2 books.
So how does that work?
At a certain point, they got ahead of me, which I really didn't think would happen, but I'm slow, and they were fast.
So in Fire and Blood, can you give us... obviously, we don't want to do any spoilers, because that's the thing that people really hate. Can you give us a kind of overview? This is what to expect, or not?
Yeah, I can say a little about it. First of all, it's not written by me. It's written by Archmaester Gildane of the Citadel of Old Town.
Of course.
And
I like him.
he's a crotchety old coot. He's strongly opinionated, and he's writing the history of the Targaryen dynasty from about the time of Robert's Rebellion. So he's looking back, and he's writing the history, but it's 300 years before. So he wasn't there for the history. So he's, like any good historian, he's drawing on primary sources, on court records and documents and memoirs of the people who were around at the time. And I had a lot of fun with that because, of course, these memoirs and court documents and observations of the time don't necessarily agree with each other. And sometimes he's presenting 3 very different versions of what might have happened at that time, particularly during the Dance of the Dragons, which is the great Targaryen civil war in which a half-brother and half-sister contended for the Iron Throne. There are 3 primary sources. One of them is Grand Maester Orwyle, who was keeping the official court documents and writing his private observations and letters to the Citadel. There was Septon Eustace, who was the Septon of the Red Keep, the holy man, the cleric, the priest. So he was looking at everything in terms of gods. And then there was Mushroom. Mushroom was the court jester, the fool, a dwarf, a rather lascivious, dirty-minded dwarf. And so his version in the Testimony of Mushroom is the one where he tells who poisoned who and who was having an affair with who.
How do we ever know the truth, though, George?
Grandmaster Gildane says we cannot know the truth. Here are 3 stories.
We
You'll
have
have to
fun,
make
we have fun
sense.
getting there, though, don't we?
So you have very similar characters to the characters that are in Game of Thrones.
Well, there are certain similarities, but not really. Not really. And all the Targaryens at this time have dragons. So it was a time when the Dance with the Dragons began, there were 17 living dragons.
17?
Not just 3, 17,
Oh, wow.
yes. Ranging from hatchlings to really big ones, dragons that dwarf any of Dany's.